Following on from the prior lesson on the ovarian cycle, we're now going to dive into the menstrual cycle. Now, before we go deep into the different stages of the menstrual cycle, it's important that we define exactly what the menstrual cycle is. And simply put, the ovarian cycle is a series of changes in the uterus, and they align very closely with that of the ovarian cycle. But the key thing that I'm going to underline here is that word uterus. While in the ovarian cycle, we look at what happens in the ovary, in the menstrual cycle, we're looking very closely at what is happening to the uterus. And more specifically within the uterus, we're looking at the lining, we're looking at the endometrium. We're looking at how it develops in preparation for that embryo and in preparation for implantation. So on the right-hand side of this diagram here, you can see that we've got 4 rough phases. The first phase in purple is going around the outside in yellow now. This is where that uterine lining itself breaks down and menstruation or menstrual flow occurs, roughly during the first 5 days. Now, the next stage, days 6 through 10, again, this is all very rough, is when the uterus is beginning to build up its lining. It's going to try and build up that endometrium in preparation for implantation a little bit later on in the cycle. Now, ovulation generally occurs, according to the ovarian cycle, on day 14, but we know from our lesson on the ovarian cycle that this can range quite dramatically depending on the woman. Now, when we're talking about the ovarian cycle, ovulation occurs, and during this stage, the uterus is just continuing to thicken. And this continues all the way through up until about day 28 if we follow a 28-day cycle, and it is at this time, around day 28, that either implantation has already occurred, and so the uterine lining continues to thicken, or if no implantation occurs, that uterus and that uterine lining will break down, leading to menstruation. So let's, now that we've got a rough overview, dive into each of these stages with a little bit more detail. So, that first stage, days 1 through 5, menstruation. So, when we talk about menstruation, menstruation is composed of blood from the broken down capillaries, mucus secretions, and also cell debris, all from that uterine wall. And these 3 things, in conjunction with a whole bunch of other stuff, are passed through the vagina, and that is what is known as menstruation. Now, as menstruation is the easiest thing to observe throughout this cycle, it is recognised as day 1 of the menstrual period. And day 1 of the menstrual period is also considered day 1 of that menstrual cycle. So on our diagram down here, I'm highlighting that menstrual phase now in yellow, and we can see up in the middle part of the diagram that it also mentions this menstrual flow, where we go from this large bed of capillaries down to a much smaller bed of capillaries by the end of that first stage. Moving on into the next stage, which I'll represent in green here, is known as pre-ovulation. And pre-ovulation is that anywhere prior to ovulation and after the end of that menstrual phase. And what happens during pre-ovulation is that we know the follicle is developing in the ovary, but the key part for us in the menstrual cycle is that the endometrium is becoming thicker and softer. And as it's becoming thicker and softer, the number of blood vessels and mucus-secreting glands is going to increase. And we can see that represented in our diagram here, where from day 5 onwards, this here is really beginning to increase that lining of the endometrium. Day 14, roughly, is that ovulation phase. And it's a really small phase in our diagram here, ovulation. Now, when we talk about ovulation, this is mostly to do with the ovarian cycle, but it's where that mature follicle ruptures, the secondary oocyte is released, and that is stimulated by that spike in luteinizing hormone. In terms of the changes to the endometrium, nothing really happens apart from that continuing development of the endometrium itself. Following on from ovulation comes the secretory phase. And during this phase, again, the endometrium continues to thicken, and the glands that have been secreting that mucus really begin to secrete a mucus-rich in glycogen. Now, glycogen, as you may remember, is a stored form of sugar, and sugar being a really easily available form of energy. Now, two things can happen here. Number one, if the secondary oocyte isn't fertilised, we've known previously that the corpus luteum will break down, and that is going to reduce the volume of progesterone released. Now, as the volume of progesterone decreases, the endometrium is no longer being maintained. So that progesterone is directly related to the development of the endometrium itself. So in this secretory phase, we're really looking at this sort of part of our diagram here. That endometrium has continued to thicken up until a point where, if not fertilised, no more progesterone is present, and as such, that lining is no longer maintained. And this leads us into the last little part of our diagram, and that is premenstruation. So anything from about day 26 onwards, I'll highlight here from around day 25, but when we're looking at this stage here, we have the degeneration of that corpus luteum into the corpus albicans. We've already spoken previously, if no fertilisation has happened, that's going to decrease the amount of progesterone, and as a consequence, the endometrium is going to break down. This then starts off a new cycle. So where we've finished here, we can begin to see that menstrual flow beginning in the diagram here, and that kicks right off again at day one of our cycle, and that is the day of menstrual flow, or the first menstrual flow. So to line things up, I'm just going to skip down here to our diagram very quickly. In terms of the ovarian cycle, we know there are two key phases. There's the follicular phase and the luteal phase. In the middle of these two phases is when ovulation occurs. Now, if we line this up during the follicular phase, that follicle is developing. And in the menstrual cycle, what this means is that, well, the first stage, days 1 to 5, that menstrual flow, that lining is breaking down, it's being released and passed out through the vagina. After that, we have what is known here as the proliferative phase. And in that proliferative phase, this is everything pre-ovulation. Okay, so during this stage, the endometrium is beginning to build up a little bit again in preparation for this ovum. Now, if the ovum passes down and implants into the wall of the endometrium, it's going to continue to thicken. Otherwise, it will still continue to thicken in the secretory phase, and it will begin to release more glycogen and sugar, thanks to its mucus, in preparation for that. But if nothing takes place, then it's going to go back to the start here, and that build-up, or that lining that has built up, will then be passed out through the vagina as menstruation. Now, below this, we have a really handy diagram, which I won't go through now, but I will encourage you to go and have a look at in terms of the quantity of hormone throughout this menstrual and ovarian cycle. To finish off, though, I do want to talk about two key words here, and they are menarche and menopause. So in terms of menarche, this is the first menstrual period or first menstruation, and what it indicates is the start of puberty in females. And the second word is menopause. And menopause occurs roughly, I do say roughly because this depends woman to woman, but menopause roughly begins between the ages of 45 and 55, and it's where the menstrual cycle has become really irregular. And eventually it's going to stop entirely. And after that, this means that there's been roughly 35 years of potential childbearing from menarche to menopause, and only about 400 of the initial thousands of ova actually reach that stage of maturity. So now in this lesson that we've been through the menstrual cycle, hopefully you can start to link this cycle itself, the menstrual cycle, to the ovarian cycle.